Tonight, we're stepping into the strange world of medieval rules. Laws that sound completely absurd today, but in an age of castles, plagues, and terrible hygiene actually made perfect sense. Before we begin, get comfortable. And if you enjoy this kind of story, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in the morning, not from a bed exactly, but from a pile of straw doing its best impression of one. You stretch, brush off yesterday's mud, and think, maybe today I'll try to look slightly less like a walking disaster. Your eyes land on a fancy scrap of fur you spotted at the market. You imagine yourself strolling into the village, turning heads like a medieval influencer. Bad news. Congratulations. You've just broken the law. In the Middle Ages, fashion wasn't about personal taste. It was government policy. Enter the sumptuary laws, rules that essentially said, wear your social class on your sleeve. Literally, if you were a peasant, wool was your destiny. Scratchy, dull brown wool, itchy enough to make you question the meaning of existence itself. Meanwhile, nobles floated through life wrapped in silk, so bright it looked like it had been dipped in unicorn blood. Try to copy their look, and the law would notice. Authorities could fine you, humiliate you, or, if they felt particularly dramatic, throw you in jail. Imagine rotting in a dungeon while rats chew on your shoes. All because your cloak looked a little too noble for your station. Not exactly the rebellion you were hoping for. And these rules weren't vague. Oh no, purple, royalty only. Fur trims like ermine, completely forbidden unless your title was longer than your family tree. Even shoes weren't safe. The rich wore poulins, absurdly long, pointy shoes so exaggerated they had to be tied to the knees. You, on the other hand, were expected to wear sensible boots shaped like actual human feet. Practical, boring, utterly unfashionable. The logic behind all of this was simple. The wealthy wanted to remain visibly wealthy. And in medieval society, looking rich was power. If you looked too much like them, the entire fragile hierarchy might collapse. Imagine some noble being mistaken for a guy who shovels pig manure. The horror. Of course, there was also an economic angle. Nobles didn't want peasants wasting money on silk scarves when they could be spending it on rent, taxes, and maybe the occasional bribe to keep breathing. Looking good was basically theft. Theft of noble dignity. So, you slip into your mandatory sackcloth chic and shuffle into the daylight looking exactly as miserable as the law intended. Because in the Middle Ages, your greatest crime wasn't rebellion, heresy, or theft. It was daring to look fabulous while standing ankle-deep in mud. It's evening. You're sitting by the hearth enjoying the one moment of warmth you'll get all day when suddenly the town bell clangs. No, it's not calling you to dinner. It's the medieval version of your landlord telling you to stop having fun. The curfew bell. Curfew comes from the French couvre-feu. Literally, cover your fire. At the sound of that bell, you're expected to smother your hearth, snuff your candles, and basically plunge your life into darkness. Not because the authorities wanted you well rested. No, it's because your entire town is made of wood, straw, and pure flammability. One idiot leaving his candle burning could turn the whole place into a flaming inferno before midnight. So, the rule makes sense in theory, but in practice, it means you're left stumbling around your hut in the dark, tripping over chickens, and stepping into suspicious puddles you really hope are just water. Forget reading. Not that you can. Forget sewing or working late. Unless you enjoy stabbing yourself in the hand with a needle by candlelight. Nightlife, as far as you're concerned, doesn't exist. Of course, the wealthy didn't exactly follow the same rules. Nobles had stone houses and servants to make sure they didn't burn down their castles, so they could keep their fires going. But you're stuck with enforced bedtime, courtesy of the bell tower. And if you get caught ignoring it, the fine will cost you more than a week's wages. The bell wasn't just about fire safety, either. Darkness kept people indoors, which meant fewer drunks stumbling around, stabbing each other, and fewer thieves lurking in alleys. Think of it as the medieval government saying, we can't stop crime, but we can at least make sure you're too scared to leave your house after dark. So there you are, lying on your straw mattress, wide awake, listening to rats gnaw on the beams and neighbors snoring through thin wooden walls. All because someone decided the safest way to run a town was to treat every resident like a 6-year-old at bedtime. It's not glamorous, but the curfew bell probably saved countless towns from going up in smoke. Still, when you blow out your candle tonight, just remember the rule exists not because you're irresponsible, but because someone else definitely is. You wake up hungry. You've been fantasizing about roasted pork all morning, maybe even a slab of beef if you're really lucky. You walk into the kitchen, well, the one-room hut you share with your family, and reality smacks you in the face. It's Friday, which means no meat again. Welcome to medieval dietary law, courtesy of the church. Nearly half the calendar was off limits for meat. Fridays, Lent, Advent, countless feast days dedicated to saints you've never heard of. It all adds up to more fish than you ever wanted to see. Forget bacon, it's salted herring again. The spiritual message, discipline and sacrifice. The practical message, please stop eating all the cows before winter. You might think it's absurd, but it had a logic. Cows were precious. They pulled plows, gave milk, and provided leather. If everyone slaughtered them at the first sign of hunger, the agricultural system would collapse faster than your appetite at the sight of another pickled fish. These rules stretched food supplies, boosted the fishing industry, and kept some semblance of order in a world one bad harvest away from famine. Still, that doesn't make it fun. Imagine trudging home after 12 hours in the fields only to find a plate of dried fish glaring at you like it knows you're disappointed. The rich had it slightly better. They had access to sturgeon eels or elaborate almond-based fake meat dishes. You, meanwhile, were stuck gnawing on a bony carp that tasted like mud. Of course, people cheated. Smugglers sold contraband meat on fasting days, and plenty of peasants quietly roasted a chicken behind closed doors. But if you got caught, fines, public shaming, or penance, which usually meant standing in church for hours while everyone stared at you like you'd single-handedly doomed their souls. The irony is that these dietary restrictions shaped entire economies. Towns thrived on fishing. Monasteries made fortunes on preserved fish. And fasting days gave cooks a reason to get creative with grains, vegetables, and legumes. So, while you're chewing on your 47th plate of salted herring, just remember you're not suffering for nothing. You're propping up medieval Europe's version of food security. Still, no rule in history has ever made fish taste like bacon. And that's the real tragedy. You're starving. Your family is starving. The cabbage stew you've been eating all week tastes like sadness in liquid form. Then you spot it. A plump rabbit hopping merrily through the woods, practically begging to be roasted. Perfect. Right. Wrong. That rabbit belongs to your lord. Everything belongs to your lord. The trees, the deer, the boar, and yes, even that smug little rabbit. Welcome to medieval hunting law, where catching dinner without permission could make you a criminal. The forests weren't public land. They were the medieval version of a private game reserve, and your local noble wasn't about to share. He didn't care that you were chewing on turnips like a desperate goat. He wanted venison at his feast, and you weren't invited. So, if you dared to snare that rabbit, you were poaching, a crime taken about as seriously as murder. Punishments varied, but none were pleasant. Best case, a fine you couldn't possibly pay. Worst case, a hand chopped off. Really bad case, execution. Imagine being hanged for the medieval equivalent of stealing a chicken nugget. And the nobles didn't just protect their food out of greed. Hunting rights were a way of showing power. Being able to ride into the forest with hounds and crossbows wasn't just recreation. It was a live-action flex. Meanwhile, you were supposed to clap politely as your bets slaughtered animals you weren't even allowed to touch. Of course, peasants still poached. Hunger is persuasive, and rabbits breed faster than punishment could keep up. Whole villages sometimes banded together for secret hunts, slipping into the woods at night with nets and clubs. The thrill wasn't just in catching food. It was in sticking it to the system, if only for a meal. But if you got caught, let's just say the Lord didn't see you as resourceful. The irony is that while you risked death for a rabbit, nobles killed animals in bulk just for sport. Hundreds of deer could be slaughtered in a single hunt. Not because anyone needed that much meat, but because it looked impressive. So you walk home empty-handed, stomach growling, dreaming of roast rabbit you'll never taste. Because in medieval Europe, survival wasn't about skill. It was about remembering that even the wildlife knew its place better than you. You've been accused of stealing a loaf of bread. Did you steal it? Doesn't matter. In the Middle Ages, truth wasn't decided by evidence or witnesses. It was decided by God, and God apparently moonlighted as a game show host. Welcome to the trial by ordeal. Justice with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The logic was simple. If you were innocent, God would protect you. If you were guilty, He'd let you burn, drown, or bleed. Which sounds fair until you realize that medieval Europe was full of innocent people with terrible luck. Take the ordeal by fire. The judge hands you a red-hot iron bar and says, "Walk 3 paces." You do it, skin sizzling like breakfast bacon. Then they bandage your hand and wait 3 days. If it heals nicely, congratulations. You're innocent. If it furs, which in a world without soap or antibiotics, it absolutely will, guilty. Enjoy your punishment. Or maybe you get the ordeal by water. They tie you up and toss you into a pond. Sink innocent, though you're now at the bottom of the river. Float. Guilty. The logic here was that pure water would reject liars, which is exactly the kind of nonsense you come up with when no one's invented science yet. And then there was the ordeal by combat. Someone accuses you of a crime, and instead of lawyers, you both grab swords and go at it. God apparently chooses the winner, which sounds noble until you realize the other guy is 6 feet 5 inches and has been training since birth. While you've been hoeing potatoes, guess who God favors today? To be fair, these orals weren't always taken literally. Priests sometimes interpreted the results to avoid killing too many people. And eventually the church banned orals altogether in the 13th century, partly because they realized burn this guy's hand and see what happens wasn't the most reliable legal system. But for centuries, trials by ordeal were the gold standard of justice. Which means if you lived back then, your innocence wasn't proven by honesty or character. It was proven by whether or not you could survive medieval party tricks with fire and water. So, next time you complain about jury duty, remember at least no one's asking you to grab a hot iron bar and hope divine skincare saves you. It's Sunday morning. You'd like to sleep in, but the church bells are already ringing like someone's hitting a cow with a frying pan. You drag yourself to Mass because if you don't, you risk fines, penance, or worse, public gossip, which in a medieval village spreads faster than the plague. Now, here's the catch. After Mass, you're not allowed to work at all. No plowing, no weaving, no fixing the roof that's currently dripping into your stew pot. The rule is simple. Sunday is God's day, not yours. You're supposed to rest, reflect, and avoid sin. Which sounds great in theory until you realize your landlord doesn't care if you're resting. He still wants his rent, and the weeds in your field didn't get the Sabbath memo. The church, to be fair, enforced this for more than just piety. A weekly rest day kept peasants from literally working themselves into an early grave. In a world where vacation meant collapsing in the mud, Sunday was the one day you could avoid dropping dead in the field. Call it medieval HR policy wrapped in scripture. Of course, rest was a relative term. You weren't reclining with wine and cheese. You were sitting through a 2-hour Latin sermon you couldn't understand, followed by endless prayer. After that, maybe you'd sneak in a nap before the priest reminded you that idleness was also a sin. In short, Sunday gave you the choice of being bored into holiness or guilty of laziness. Naturally, exceptions existed. Nobles still hunted, servants still served, and emergencies like putting out a fire or delivering a baby didn't count as work. But if you tried to sneak in a little extra farming, someone would rat you out, and suddenly you're standing barefoot in church while the priest scolds you in front of the whole village. Still, the rule had staying power. Without it, peasants might have been worked 7 days a week until they dropped. The Sabbath gave you at least the illusion of rest, a little buffer between endless toil and inevitable death. So you trudge home from church, eat your cold porridge, and rest by staring at the wall. Congratulations, you survive another Sunday without accidentally sinning. Sort of. You've decided you're tired of farming mud and eating cabbage soup, so you want to try your hand at a trade. Maybe you'll become a baker or a blacksmith or even a weaver. Great idea, except you can't just start hammering metal or selling loaves of bread. First, you need the blessing of the medieval equivalent of a mafia family, the guild. Guilds controlled everything. Want bake bread? You have to be in the baker's guild. Want to shoe horses? Farrier's guild. Want to carve wooden spoons? Believe it or not, there was probably a guild for that too. And if you try to work outside the guild system, you'd be fined, driven out, or occasionally beaten into remembering the rules. Joining wasn't easy. First, you had to spend years as an apprentice, basically working for free in exchange for experience. After that, you'd graduateto journeyman, wandering around trying to earn wages while still under guild rules. Only after producing a masterpiece, literally a perfect example of your craft, could you apply to become a master yourself. And who judged your masterpiece? The other masters in the guild who had every reason to make sure fewer people joined their little club. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? At first glance, this all feels suffocating. But there were good reasons. Guilds set quality standards so people didn't die from bread made of sawdust or armor that shattered on the first swing. They regulated prices to avoid chaos in the marketplace. They also protected members from competition, which sounds less noble, but was very effective if you were inside the club. For you, the downside was obvious. Without guild membership, you couldn't legally sell your work. You'd end up like that one guy who tried to open a discount bakery and got his oven smashed by guild enforcers. Medieval Yelp reviews weren't written with words. They were written with bricks through your window. Still, guilds offered security. If you were part of one, you got protection, training, and a voice in your town's affairs. If not, you were just another peasant pretending to know how to hammer iron. So you swallow your pride, sweep the shop floor for 7 years as an apprentice, and hope one day your masterpiece doesn't get rejected. Because in the Middle Ages, you couldn't just follow your passion. You had to follow the guild, or else you don't own a clock. You don't even know what a clock is. Time for you is whatever the local church bell says it is. And those bells, they never stop. They ring to wake you up. They ring to drag you to prayers. They ring for work, for rest, for meals, and for bedtime. Basically, the medieval bell tower was your overbearing parent, and you couldn't even slam your bedroom door to escape it. Picture it. You're in the fields, finally making progress with a plow, when clang, clang, clang. Time to stop and pray. You mutter a few words to God, go back to work, and just as you're finding a rhythm again, clang, 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 noon bells. Time to eat your gourmet meal of bread, onions, and disappointment. A couple of hours later, just when you think maybe you'll catch up on work, vespers, off you go again. And it wasn't just about religion. The bells controlled civic life, too. They announced market openings, curfews, and emergencies. Fire in the town. Bells. Enemy attack. Bells. Somebody important died. Bells. Basically, bells were the medieval version of push notifications. Constant, loud, and impossible to turn off. The worst part, you had no say in it. The priest or town officials decided when the bells rang, and you obeyed. Didn't matter if you were tired in the middle of a meal or halfway through something important. The bell owned you. Oversleep? Everyone knows because you missed the morning bells. Leave work early. Everyone knows because the bells hadn't rung yet. Forget to show up to Mass. Guess what? The bells tattled. In theory, bells provided order in a world without watches or literacy. Most people couldn't read a calendar, let alone keep track of hours. The sound of bells structured the chaos. But for you, it meant your life was less living freely and more being Pavlov's dog centuries before Pavlov. So you trudge on, ears ringing, your entire existence carved into bell-shaped chunks of time. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't ask what time it was. You waited for the bells to tell you who you were, where you should be, and exactly how little control you actually had. You stink. Everyone stinks. It's the Middle Ages, after all. So, when you finally scrape together enough coins to visit the local bathhouse, you think maybe, just maybe, you'll leave smelling less like a damp goat. You walk in, ready to scrub weeks of filth off your skin, and find the doors barred shut. Why? Because the town authorities decided bathhouses are basically plague factories. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. Bathhouses weren't just for baths. They doubled as social clubs, gossip centers, and let's be honest, budget brothel. A place where you could chat, soak, and catch a disease all in one convenient visit. When syphilis and plague swept through Europe, the bathhouse became everyone's favorite scapegoat. Shut them down, and maybe people stop dropping like flies, or maybe they just keep stinking, which is at least less contagious. But here's the problem. Without bathhouse, your hygiene options are limited. Washing at home means hauling buckets of freezing water from the well, dumping it into a wooden tub, and pretending this counts as a spa day. Soap is expensive. Hot water is a luxury. And honestly, your family would rather use that firewood to cook food than to make sure you don't smell like despair. Of course, the nobles didn't always play by the same rules. They had private baths, perfumed oils, and servants to scrub them down. You're left rubbing yourself with a rag and hoping no one notices that your natural musk could scare away wolves. And here's the kicker. The church often viewed public bathing with suspicion anyway. Too much nudity, too much mingling of sexes, too much fun. If you enjoyed it, it was probably sinful. So Badhouse lived in this bizarre moral gray zone. Tolerated 1 year, banned the next. You never knew if your evening soak would leave you refreshed or excommunicated. So you shuffle back home. Dirt still caked under your nails, hair greasy, skin itchy. You tell yourself bathing is overrated, that nobody notices anyway. Except they do. They all do. Everyone in your village smells the same. Sweat, smoke, livestock, and failure. Because in the Middle Ages, washing yourself wasn't just about hygiene. It was about politics, morality, and whether the town thought your bathhouse was saving souls or spreading death. Spoiler, it was probably both. You've done it. After months of backbreaking work and eating porridge that tastes like sadness, you've saved a few coins. You think, maybe I'll treat myself. Maybe I'll buy something nice. Something that says, I may be poor, but I still have self-respect. Wrong. Medieval law says you can't. Welcome back to Sumpta Laws, the rules that made sure you never dressed better than your betters. Let's say you're a wealthy merchant. You've made decent money trading wool, and now you want a velvet tunic. Not so fast. Velvet is reserved for nobles. Purple cloth? Forget it. That's basically the medieval trademark color of royalty. Fur trims. Only if your family tree includes someone with a third at the end of their name. For you, the law demands beige potato sack chic. And the enforcement dead serious. Inspectors actually roam towns, checking hems, fabrics, and colors. If you wore silk without the right pedigree, you get fined. Imagine trying to explain that you're in debt because you bought a shirt slightly too shiny. It's fashion policing in its purest form. The logic, of course, was order. If a duke and a merchant both walked into church wearing the same outfit, chaos might ensue. How would anyone know whom about it? Nobles couldn't risk being mistaken for commoners, so the law kept the classes visually separated, like medieval color-coded uniforms. And don't think you could sneak around the rules. People tattled. If your neighbor spotted you in a cloak that looked a little too luxurious, they'd rat you out. Not because they cared about the law, but because watching you get humiliated in court was the best entertainment they'd have all month. Meanwhile, the nobles themselves strutted around in outfits so gaudy they needed entire servants just to carry their sleeves. Their shoes curled into points so long they had to be tied to their knees. But you're lucky if you're allowed a belt buckle that doesn't rust. So, you put away your dreams of velvet and settle for another wool tunic blending back into the gray-brown sea of mediocrity that was medieval fashion for the non-elite. Because in this world, clothes didn't just make the man. They reminded him exactly how low he ranked. You're hungry again, which is less of a surprise and more of a permanent state of being. Today you think, maybe I'll splurge on something fancy, a goose or white bread like the nobles eat. Unfortunately, the medieval rule book is already laughing at you. Because in this world, even your dinner is a reminder that you're not important. Food was divided by class, and the laws made sure you knew it. Nobles got the good stuff. Venison, swan, pheasant, and white bread made from refined flour. You, on the other hand, got barley bread so dense it could double as a weapon. You ate onions, leeks, cabbage, and more cabbage. When in doubt, always more cabbage. Your stew wasn't seasoned with herbs. It was seasoned with despair. White bread was especially humiliating. It wasn't just tastier. It was literally a status symbol. Only the wealthy could afford to waste good flour on fancy loaves while you were stuck with dark bread that looked and tasted like a door's stop. And if you try to get around it, say buy a goose on the sly or sneak some venison into your pot, congratulations. You're guilty of eating above your station. Fines, shaming, or worse. Imagine explaining to your children that you're in prison because of bread. The rules weren't only about class snobbery. They also had practical roots. By reserving high-status foods for the elite, society rationed limited resources. If every peasant roasted swans on Sunday, there'd be no swans left for the Duke's feast. And let's be honest, the Duke's feast was always going to matter more than your survival. Of course, this didn't stop peasants from dreaming. Ballads and jokes often poke fun at the idea of a poor man sneaking venison or a roast goose. Food was the fantasy equivalent of winning the lottery. You weren't imagining castles or crowns, just one meal that didn't taste like boiled mud. So you choked down another bowl of thin barley GRL, staring wistfully at the noble's banquet hall across the way. They're tearing in a roast peacock while you gnaw on bread hard enough to chip a tooth. Because in medieval Europe, even what you ate was a law-enforced reminder that your place in the world was firmly at the bottom of the table. You cough once in the marketplace. Bad move. Suddenly, every set of eyes is on you like you've just confessed to witchcraft. Welcome to plague season, where one sneeze can get your entire neighborhood shut down. In the Middle Ages, quarantine wasn't optional. If someone in your house got sick, the authorities would happily lock your door from the outside and nail a cross on it, so the whole town knew you were basically a walking biohazard. You didn't leave until everyone inside was either cured or buried. Fresh air, forget it. The rule was better one dead family than a dead village. Comforting markets closed, weddings, fairs, and festivals gone. Basically, everything that made life slightly less miserable was outlawed. The logic was sound. Keep people apart, and maybe they stop spreading death like it's free samples at a fair. But for you, it meant starvation, isolation, and lots of awkward conversations with your family in one cramped room. If you were unlucky enough to be a gravedigger, things got even worse. The authorities forced you to work day and night hauling corpses, digging trenches, and trying not to catch the very thing you were burying. Refuse, and you'd be punished like a criminal. Accept, and you probably die anyway. Career options were bleak, and let's not forget the travel bans. Whole towns locked their gates to outsiders. Strangers were treated with suspicion. Merchants were turned away, and if you did manage to sneak in, you were greeted with pitchforks instead of hospitality. Tourism in plague years wasn't exactly thriving. Of course, these rules had their moments of medieval brilliance. Some cities actually reduced death tolls by enforcing strict quarantine. Others just panicked, shut everything down, and hoped God would notice. Either way, the result was the same. You trapped at home, rationing stale bread and hoping your neighbor's cough didn't drift through the walls. So, you sit in your sealed-off house, staring at your family, wondering who's going to start coughing next. The only upside, for once, you don't have to go to church. But it's hard to celebrate when the priest is outside marking your door like it's the medieval version of a hazard sticker. Because in the Middle Ages, breaking quarantine didn't just mean risking your life. It meant risking the whole village. And the whole village was very motivated to make sure you stayed inside permanently if necessary. You finally died. Congrats. The bad news, even in death, the rules still have you by the throat. You'd think burial would be simple. Dig a hole, drop you in, say a prayer, done. But no, this is the Middle Ages. Your final resting place depends less on your soul and more on your wallet. First problem, consecrated ground. If you want to be buried in the churchyard, you need money. Fees for a proper grave, fees for the priest, fees for candles. If you can't pay, your body might get shoved into a mass grave outside the walls with a nice scenic view of the local garbage heap. Hope you like the smell of rotting cabbage, because you'll be sharing eternity with it. Second problem, space. Cemeteries filled up fast, and when they ran out of room, the grave diggers didn't exactly expand the real estate. They just dug you up after a few years, tossed your bones in a corral pit, and recycled your plot. Yes, even in death, you got evicted. Nothing says rest and peace like being stacked like firewood in the corner of a bone house. Third problem, rules about how you died. Suicide. Forget consecrated ground. Executed for a crime. Your corpse might end up hanging on display or buried at a crossroads so your restless soul wouldn't bother decent people. Die of plague straight into the nearest trench. Quicklime sprinkled on top. No ceremony, no dignity. And don't think the church was always sympathetic. If you'd been excommunicated, they wouldn't even let your body near holy ground. Basically, sorry. Eternal damnation wasn't enough. Now you're banned from the graveyard, too. The wealthy, of course, had it better. Nobles got tombs, effigies, and sometimes even a permanent spot inside the church itself. where their marble likeness could glare down at peasants for centuries. You're lucky if your grave marker isn't just a rock with "Here lies nobody important" scratched on it. So even in death, you realize the Middle Ages never stopped reminding you of your place. The rules didn't just tell you how to live, they told you how to rot. And the final joke, your descendants will probably forget where you're buried anyway. Because in medieval Europe, even the afterlife had a waiting list. You're sitting in a tavern a few mugs of ale deep when your friend mutters something about the bishop's new hat looking like a stolen beehive. You laugh, maybe a little too loudly. Bad idea. In the Middle Ages, mocking the church wasn't just bad manners. It was a crime, a serious one. See, the church wasn't just about Sunday sermons and stained glass windows. It was the single largest landowner in Europe, wealthier than kings. And basically the medieval version of both Amazon and the IRS combined, which meant insulting a priest or questioning doctrine was like trash-talking your boss while the boss owns your house, your food supply, and your soul. Not smart. Punishments varied, but none were pleasant. You might be fined, forced to do public penance. Imagine standing barefoot in church while everyone stares at you like you farted during Mass. Or, if you really pushed it, branded a heretic. And once that label stuck, things got hot, literally. Because heresy and fire tended to go hand in hand. The rules weren't just about protecting faith. They were about protecting power. The church's authority depended on people believing it was untouchable. If you could mock a priest without consequences, the whole system might start to wobble. And the medieval church did not tolerate wobbling. So you kept your jokes to yourself. Sure, maybe you whispered them after dark in the barn when you were absolutely sure no one was listening. But even then, you had to be careful. Neighbors tattled. People earned favors by reporting blasphemy. And let's be honest, who wouldn't sell you out if it meant a little less penance for themselves? Meanwhile, clergy themselves weren't always models of virtue. Some lived lavishly, had mistresses, or hoarded wealth. But criticizing that, off limits. You had to smile, nod, and pretend that the bishop's 15-course feast was spiritually uplifting while you gnawed on stale bread. So, you bite your tongue, laugh politely at sermons, and never ever make jokes about priests in public again. Because in the Middle Ages, free speech didn't exist. And if you forgot that, the church had plenty of creative ways to remind you. Because here, sticks and stones might break your bones, but words could definitely get you burned. It's nightfall. You're finally home after a long day of bending your spine in half for someone else's profit. All you want is to sit by the fire, eat your watery stew, and maybe not freeze to death. But just as you're starting to feel human again, the church bell clangs. The message is clear. Cover your fire. Snuff your candles. Fun time's over. This wasn't a suggestion. It was law. Your hearth had to be covered at night, or you risked fines, punishment, or worse, burning the entire village down because you nodded off with a log still smoldering. And in a town made entirely of wood, thatched roofs, and bad decisions, fire spread faster than gossip after Mass. One drunk farmer could turn everyone's house into a bonfire, and nobody wanted that. So you obey. You shovel dirt over your fire, muttering curses under your breath, and spend the rest of the evening shivering in the dark. Your entertainment options are limited. Talk to your family who you're sick of. Listen to rats in the rafters, or lie awake imagining how warm nobles are right now in their stone castles with multiple fireplaces roaring. Of course, the rich didn't always follow this rule. Lords and bishops had stone halls and servants to manage the flames, so they could afford to keep the fire going all night. You, however, are the risk. The law wasn't written for them. It was written because your Havel is basically one giant torch waiting to happen. And while the rule did prevent devastating fires, it also made nights miserable. Darkness wasn't peaceful. It was terrifying. Thieves, wolves, drunk neighbors looking for fights all thrived after the curfew. The fire wasn't just warmth. It was protection. Without it, you sit in the dark like bait, hoping nothing out there decides you look edible. Still, the law stood for centuries. Fire was both your best friend and your worst enemy. And medieval life was already dangerous enough without waking up in a pile of ashes. So you pull the blanket tighter, listen to silence, and wait for dawn. Because in the Middle Ages, survival wasn't about comfort. It was about obedience. And if that meant freezing at night so the whole town didn't burn, then congratulations. You've once again suffered for the greater good. Exile was nothing new in the Viking world. Honor-bound societies had a brutal way of dealing with troublemakers. If you killed the wrong man or upset the fragile balance of power, you were outlawed. That's exactly what happened to Eric the Red. After a series of violent disputes in Iceland, including a blood feud that left men dead, Eric was sentenced to banishment. With nowhere to go, he looked westward, chasing stories of a distant land glimpsed by sailors blown off course. When Eric's ship finally cut through the fog and ice to reach Greenland's coast, it must have seemed more punishment than promise. The horizon was jagged with glaciers. The valleys were windswept and barren, the soil thin and rocky. Winter bit hard, even in summer months. To most, this was no place for farming, much less raising families. But Eric was not just a warrior. He was a salesman. He understood the power of words in shaping destiny. He chose to call this harsh new land Greenland. It was a bold lie, but a useful one. Where others saw cold stone and snow fields, Eric painted a vision of fertile meadows and grassy slopes. The name alone suggested hope, a place where farmers might prosper, where families could start fresh, and where land-hungry settlers could escape the overcrowding of Iceland. His genius was not in taming Greenland, but in convincing others it could be tamed. Back in Iceland, Eric spread his pitch with the confidence of a seasoned chieftain. He told of valleys where sheep would graze, of fjords rich with fish, of hillsides ready for plows. He emphasized abundance, not scarcity. The promise of land was irresistible to Viking families pressed by growing populations and limited resources at home. By 985 CE, Eric had gathered a fleet of long ships filled with hopeful settlers, livestock, and tools. Some came for necessity, others for adventure. They risked everything on Eric's promise, leaving familiar soil for a world that was more ice than green. What awaited them was not paradise, but survival at its harshest. Yet, without Eric's cunning rebranding, Greenland might have remained an empty wilderness, known only to drifting sailors. Instead, it became the stage for one of the boldest experiments in Viking endurance. In the summer of 985 CE, the great gamble began. Eric the Red had convinced dozens of families to join him, and together they prepared their long ships for the most dangerous voyage of their lives. Unlike raiding expeditions, this was not a quick strike across the sea. These ships carried everything needed to build a society from scratch. Cattle and sheep crammed into pens on deck, goats tethered beside barrels of water, sacks of grain for planting, iron tools, and chests of precious cloth and timber. Children clung to their mothers, while warriors stood at the rails, scanning the horizon for danger. The crossing from Iceland to Greenland was no gentle cruise. The North Atlantic was a cruel teacher, and the Vikings knew it well. Fog rolled in thick, hiding the cliffs and reefs until they seemed to spring from nowhere. Sudden squalls ripped through sails, snapping ropes and drenching passengers to the bone. Sea ice floated in great, jagged slabs, threatening to crush a hull if struck. Many nights, the only sound was the creak of timber and the prayers whispered into the dark. Not every ship survived. The sagas tell us that of the 25 or so long ships that set out, only about 14 reached Greenland. The rest were lost to storms, shipwreck, or forced to turn back, limping home with broken masts and shattered hopes. Those who pressed on did so with grim determination. To turn back meant shame, to continue meant danger, but also the chance at new land and freedom from old debts. Life aboard ship was cramped and relentless. Families huddled under woolen cloaks, fighting seasickness and hunger. Meals were hard bread, dried fish, and whatever could be boiled in cedar. Livestock fouled the decks, and the stench clung to everyone. Yet there was also resilience. Women spun yarn from wool, even at sea, keeping their hands busy. Men sang rowing chants when the wind died, voices rising against the howl of the waves. Children too young to understand the stakes found moments of laughter playing with driftwood toys between bouts of terror when the ship pitched too violently. After weeks of this peril, the settlers finally sighted Greenland's icy cliffs. Exhausted, battered, but alive, they had crossed the most unforgiving waters in the world. The land that rose before them was no green paradise, but it was theirs, and that was enough to begin. When the settlers first stepped onto Greenland's rocky shores, relief quickly gave way to reality. There were no forests to cut for timber, no soft fields ready for farming, and little sign of abundance. The mountains were bare, the valleys narrow, and the climate unforgiving. If the Vikings were to survive here, they would have to wrestle a home out of the land itself. The solution was both simple and ingenious. Turf houses. Strips of sod were cut from the ground, stacked like bricks, and packed tightly together. The walls could be several feet thick, insulating against the freezing winds that swept down from the glaciers. Driftwood, washed ashore after long journeys across the sea, became the skeleton of their dwellings. Roof beams, door frames, and supports. The Vikings learned to scavenge every scrap of wood that the ocean offered, treating each log as treasure. Inside, these homes were dim and smoky. The only light came from small openings covered in animal skins, while fires smoldered in stone hearths, filling the rooms with both warmth and choking fumes. Yet, compared to the cold outside, they were sanctuaries. Families slept side by side on benches lined with furs, sharing body heat through the endless winter nights. The smell of drying fish, smoldering peat, and livestock penned nearby clung to every corner. It was far from luxurious, but it was survival. The settlement grew slowly with each family carving out a farmstead. Barns and byres were built into the landscape, sheltering cattle, sheep, and goats through the frost. Fences were woven from driftwood or stone, enclosing precious pastures where animals grazed during the short summer. Women worked tirelessly at spinning wool, weaving cloth, and tending to children, while men hunted seals, caribou, and even the occasional polar bear to supplement the meager stores of food. The communal effort bound the settlers together. Neighbors shared labor, tools, and stories around the fire. The harshness of Greenland demanded cooperation. Isolation meant death. Yet within this frozen frontier, the Vikings managed to recreate a version of their Scandinavian homelands, halls for feasting, farms for families, and even small churches in later years. What they built was not just shelter, but hope. These turf and driftwood homes symbolized their refusal to yield, proof that even in one of the world's harshest environments, the Vikings could carve out a world of their own. To a Viking farmer, fertile soil was wealth itself. But in Greenland, soil was scarce, thin, and stubborn. The settlers quickly learned that farming here was nothing like in Iceland or Norway. Summers were short, barely long enough for grass to grow, and winters dragged on endlessly. Yet the survival of the colony depended on coaxing every scrap of food from the land. Sheep and goats became the backbone of their farms. They could graze on the tough grasses that clung to the valleys and provided wool, milk, and eventually meat. Cattle were more difficult, prized for their milk and status, but costly to feed during the long winters. Storing hay was an all-consuming task. Families spent summers cutting every blade of grass they could find, drying it, and stacking it in barns for the dark months ahead. A shortage of hay meant starvation for animals and people alike. Crops were limited. Barley and rye were attempted in shelter plots, but the yields were meager. The settlers relied heavily on dairy, butter, cheese, and curds that could be stored and traded. Fish and seal meat filled in the gaps, though hunting was risky and often required long journeys across treacherous ice. Women brewed whey into sour drinks, while children learned early to help herd sheep, gather eggs, and tend small gardens of herbs. It was a precarious balance. A single bad harvest, a colder than usual summer, or an outbreak of disease among the animals could mean disaster. Archaeological evidence shows bones of dogs and even newborn calves butchered during lean years, desperate attempts to stretch food supplies when famine loomed. Survival in Greenland was not just about skill. It was about endurance and luck. Yet farming was more than sustenance. It was identity. The settlers saw themselves as landholders, free farmers in the Norse tradition, tied to their animals and fields. Even in this icy frontier, they clung to the rhythms of home. Milking at dawn, hay cutting in summer, slaughtering livestock in autumn, storing food for winter. Farming anchored them in a world that constantly threatened to sweep them away. Greenland tested their resolve at every turn. The land gave little, demanded much, and punished mistakes. But for over 4 centuries, Viking families held on, proving that even at the edge of the known world, the farmer's way of life could endure, at least for a time. 4 Viking children in Greenland. Life began in the shadows of turf houses and under the gaze of a community fighting for survival. Unlike in the bustling markets of Norway or the farms of Iceland, childhood here was not about carefree play. It was about learning early, working hard, and enduring a world where death always hovered near. From the moment they could walk, children were given tasks. The youngest carried water, gathered dung for fuel, or helped keep watch over sheep grazing in the valley. Slightly older children herded goats, milked cows, or collected driftwood along the fjord. Girls learned to spin wool and weave under the patient if stern guidance of their mothers, while boys trailed their fathers into the hills, watching how to hunt seals, set nets for fish, or carve tools from bone. Childhood was apprenticeship, and mistakes could be costly. Still, there was room for joy. Archaeologists have uncovered small carved toys, horses, boats, and figures fashioned from bone and wood. These fragments suggest that even in hardship, parents try to give their children laughter. The fjord became playgrounds where kids skipped stones across the water or raced to climb rocky slopes. But always play was tempered by responsibility. Childhood was brief. Adulthood came quickly. Education was oral, steeped in stories and sagas. Around the hearth at night, elders told of Odin and Thor, or the voyages of legendary ancestors. These tales weren't just entertainment. They were lessons in courage, cunning, and endurance. Later, as Christianity took root, children learned prayers in Latin, though most could not read or write. Memory was their library and storytelling their textbook. Danger was ever present. Sickness spread easily in cramped turf houses. Winters were brutal, and famine sometimes claimed the youngest first. Graves of children, some as young as a few months old, have been found near the settlements. Their short lives a reminder of how fragile survival was. Yet, families kept having children, not only for love, but for necessity. More hands meant more help, and more help meant a greater chance the household would endure. In Greenland, a child's laughter could pierce the monotony of hardship, but behind every smile lay the sobering truth. They were being prepared for a life of constant struggle. From birth, they were heirs to the same resilience their parents carried across the sea, resilience that kept the settlement alive for generations. In Greenland's Viking settlements, survival was not only won by the men who hunted or plowed, it was held together by the relentless labor of women. Inside dim turf houses, women's work was the invisible thread that kept families alive, and without it, the colony would have crumbled within a generation. Weaving was at the heart of this labor. Wool from sheep and goats was carded, spun, and transformed into cloth on upright looms that stood in the smoky rooms of farmhouses. The cloth was not just for clothing. It was currency. Woven wool known as vadmal was traded across the North Atlantic, and in Greenland, it became one of the colony's most valuable exports. A woman's skill at weaving was therefore not just domestic but economic power. Her hours bent over the loom, shaping the prosperity of her household. But weaving was only one thread of their burden. Women tended the dairy, milking cows and goats, making butter, cheese, and sky, a kind of sour milk curd. These products were staples of the Greenland diet, stored carefully to last through the long winter. A failed batch could mean hunger months later. Women also managed the hearth, keeping the fire alive through endless nights, cooking with little more than fish, seal meat, and dried grains. Their work demanded constant vigilance, for a single lapse could leave a family cold and starving. Childbearing added yet another layer of hardship. With limited medical knowledge and harsh conditions, childbirth was perilous. Many women died young, leaving families fractured. Those who survived juggled infants strapped to their backs while they spun wool or tended to livestock. Children were often raised communally with older daughters helping to care for their younger siblings, further entwining women's roles with the survival of the whole community. Women were also keepers of memory. In the evenings when fires burned low, they recited sagas, prayers, and ancestral tales. As Christianity spread, women maintained devotional practices, teaching children their first prayers and organizing family rituals around feast days. They became both spiritual anchors and cultural preservers, ensuring that Norse identity endured even on the icy margins of the known world. Though their names rarely appear in sagas, Greenland's Viking women were the colony's backbone. Their weaving clothed the settlers. Their dairy filled the larders. Their labor raised the walls of every household. In silence and smoke, they forged the fabric of life itself, proving that survival in Greenland was as much a woman's triumph as a man's. Even at the edge of the world, faith traveled with the settlers. When Eric the Red's people arrived in Greenland, most were still bound to the old Norse gods: Odin the All-Seeing, Thor the Thunderer, Freya of fertility and love. Sacrifices, charms, and sagas tied them to a spiritual world that had guided their ancestors for centuries. Yet, by the time the colony matured, Christianity had spread across Scandinavia, and its influence reached Greenland's fjords as well. The shift was dramatic. Eric himself resisted conversion, stubbornly loyal to the old gods. But his wife, Theodhild, embraced Christianity with zeal. She insisted on building a small church near their farm at Brattahlid despite Eric's protests. The sagas tell us that Eric refused to enter it, dismissing the new faith as weakness. Still, Theodhild's chapel became a gathering point, the first Christian church in Greenland. From that modest turf-walled structure, Christianity began to take root. By the early 12th century, the colony had bishops, priests, and stone churches, most famously the great cathedral at Gard. Its remains still stand today, thick stone walls rising above the grass, silent testimony to faith in a land where survival itself was a daily battle. Religion brought more than ritual. It tied Greenland to the wider world. Bishops in Norway sent priests, and Greenlanders sent back walrus ivory, furs, and hides to pay tithes and keep their spiritual lifeline alive. Faith also reshaped daily life. Pagan feasts were replaced or reinterpreted through Christian holidays. Children were baptized, marriages blessed, and the dead buried in consecrated ground. Even in this harsh frontier, settlers wanted to be part of the universal Christian community, to know their souls were connected to those in Norway, Iceland, and beyond. Yet, traces of the old ways lingered. Amulets shaped like Thor's hammer have been found alongside crosses, suggesting that many Greenlanders hedged their bets, carrying both traditions into the uncertain future. In such a perilous land, it made sense to call on every possible power, old and new. Faith gave Greenland settlers something beyond survival. It gave meaning. To bow their heads in prayer within turf churches while winds howled outside was to insist that life here was not merely endurance, but part of a divine order. Their faith did not melt the ice or soften the soil, but it gave them the courage to face both. Greenland may have felt like the edge of the world, but the Vikings who lived there were never entirely cut off. From the beginning, survival depended on maintaining ties with Iceland and Norway. The settlers could produce wool, dairy, and hides, but they lacked many essentials: iron for tools, timber for building, and luxury goods that reinforced status. To bridge the gap, they turned to trade, creating lifelines across the storm-tossed North Atlantic. Walrus ivory was Greenland's most prized export. Walrus tusks carved and polished were shipped to Europe, where they became chess pieces, religious artifacts, and luxury ornaments. Hunting walrus was no easy task. It meant long expeditions north into icy waters, braving polar bears, treacherous seas, and bitter cold. But the ivory fetched high prices, and for a time, it kept the colony relevant in European markets. Alongside ivory came furs, seal skins, and even rope made from walrus hide, all commodities that tethered Greenland to the wider medieval economy. In exchange, ships brought grain, iron, wood, and goods that could not be produced locally. Priests and bishops traveled back and forth, ensuring the colony's spiritual connection to the church. Letters and rumors carried news of kings, crusades, and wars that felt impossibly distant, yet still shaped Greenland's fate. Each ship that arrived in the fjords was both a relief and a reminder. They were not forgotten, but they were far away. Yet, isolation always loomed. Years could pass without a single ship from Europe. Storms, politics, or simple neglect could silence Greenland's link to the outside world. During these gaps, settlers had to stretch dwindling supplies, repair broken tools with bone or stone, and improvise where trade would once have saved them. The psychological weight of this uncertainty was immense. Every summer, families scanned the horizon for sails, hoping, praying that a ship would appear. Despite the hardships, Greenlanders remained proud participants in the Norse world. They told stories of life, Ericsson sailing even further west toward lands of forests and game. They sent gifts to kings and churches, asserting their place in the Norse tapestry. But beneath this pride was a fragile truth. Their survival hinged on ships that might not come. Greenland was connected, yes, but always precariously so, caught between trade and isolation, belonging and abandonment. For centuries, the north of Greenland endured, carving a fragile life out of the ice. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, the settlements began to weaken. Archaeology and sagas together hint at a slow unraveling. Not a single dramatic collapse, but a steady fading. Like a fire that runs out of fuel, climate was one enemy. The so-called Little Ice Age gripped the North Atlantic, bringing colder winters and shorter summers. Pastures shrank, hay harvests failed, and livestock starved. Farming, always precarious, became nearly impossible. Families slaughtered animals early, cut back on herds, and struggled to keep food in storage. Children's bones from late burials show signs of malnutrition, proof that hunger haunted the colony's final years. Trade also faltered as walrus ivory lost value in Europe, displaced by elephant ivory from Africa. Greenland's main export collapsed. Fewer ships came. Without imports of iron, timber, and grain, the settlers turned inward, repairing tools with bone, patching roofs with whatever would drift it ashore. Isolation, once an inconvenience, became a death sentence. Conflict with the Inuit may have played a role as well. The Norse called them Skraelings, and though evidence suggests contact, trade, and occasional coexistence, tensions surely flared. Inuit kayaks and hunting techniques were better suited to the Arctic environment. As Norse farmers clung stubbornly to European ways, the Inuit thrived where they faltered. Some scholars believe competition over resources, seals, walrus, and fishing grounds deepened the Norse struggle. Religion remained strong to the end. Churches were still built, and priests still held mass, even as pews emptied. A wedding feast in the early 15th century is the last written record of Norse Greenland. A snapshot of joy in the face of decline. After that, silence. By the mid-400s, no ships returned. No messages came. The colony vanished from European memory. Its people absorbed into the land they had fought so hard to claim. When explorers later rediscovered the ruins, stone churches, collapsed farmhouses, abandoned fields, they found haunting reminders of resilience. Turf walls still stood against the wind. Gravestones marked names long forgotten. The Norse of Greenland had not failed for lack of courage, but because even courage has limits. At the edge of the world, they endured as long as humanly possible until the ice, the hunger, and the silence claimed them. For the Erie, marriage was never just about two people choosing to live together. It was the binding of bloodlines, the cementing of clan alliances, and sometimes the avoidance of conflict. In a world where kinship determined protection, honor, and survival, marriage was a political and social contract first, and a private union second. Clans were the core of Aryan society. Every man and woman belonged, not just to a family, but to an extended network of kin stretching across valleys and hilltop settlements. These clans controlled land, resources, and warriors. When two young people married, the event reshaped more than their daily lives. It reshaped alliances between groups. A marriage could secure peace between rivals, strengthen trading bonds, or enhance military cooperation. In this way, the personal was always political. Negotiations over marriage were carried out by elders, men of authority who weighed the advantages carefully. They considered the wealth of the bride's family, the reputation of the groom's lineage, and the long-term gains that such a union could bring. A marriage was rarely spontaneous. It was the result of calculated decision-making, a strategy for survival in a world of shifting loyalties. Yet, this emphasis on clan-centered unions did not strip marriage of its symbolic power. Weddings were moments when the collective identity of a clan was displayed. The joining of two families was celebrated not only as a personal milestone, but as a triumph for the wider community. Songs, rituals, and public ceremonies all reminded those present that marriage was larger than the bride and groom. It was a new link in the chain of kinship that bound the Eryans together. For the individuals involved, this clan-centered view could be both a blessing and a burden. A bride might be given to a family she barely knew, her duty tied to her father's promises. A groom might find his marriage shaped more by alliances than by affection. Still, within these unions, bonds could grow stronger over time, forged by shared labor, children, and the constant reminder that their marriage carried the weight of entire clans. In Aryan society, then to marry was to step into the web of collective destiny. The ceremony may have joined two people, but the consequences reached far wider, echoing across kin groups, alliances, and generations. In Aryan culture, marriage was rarely a matter of personal choice. It was arranged, negotiated, and carefully managed by the elders of the clan. Fathers, uncles, and respected male leaders were the architects of these unions, sitting together to weigh the potential benefits and obligations of every match. For them, the happiness of the bride and groom was secondary to the prosperity, safety, and influence of their families. The process could be long and deliberate. Elders considered lineage, wealth, land rights, and even past rivalries. If one clan had a history of feuds with another, a marriage could heal wounds and create a bond stronger than any treaty. If a family needed to solidify its standing, marrying into a wealthier or more respected clan was a way to elevate status. For warrior families, unions could ensure military support in times of conflict. In every case, marriage was a calculated step in the chess game of survival. For the bride and groom, this often meant little say in their own futures. Young women especially were subject to the decisions of their fathers, who sought the most advantageous union. A bride could be promised to a man she barely knew, her marriage arranged when she was still a child. Grooms, too, were bound by the choices of their elders. While a young man might dream of a certain match, duty usually overruled desire. Yet arranged marriages were not without their benefits. In a world where clans faced constant threats from rival tribes, foreign invaders, and even natural hardships, arranged unions gave stability. A young couple entering marriage did so with the full support of two extended kin groups. Their farms would be better supplied, their children more secure, and their disputes mediated by a wider network of family alliances. The rituals surrounding arranged marriages reinforced this collective nature. The negotiations were not held in secrecy, but often in public gatherings where agreements were witnessed and celebrated by the community. This visibility made the marriage not just a personal union, but a communal contract. Everyone present was reminded that marriage was a tool for shaping the destiny of the clan as a whole. In this way, arranged marriages were less about stifling individual choice and more about ensuring collective survival. They embodied the Aryan worldview that the strength of the clan came first, and personal lives existed within that greater framework. No Aryan marriage was complete without the exchange of wealth, most often in the form of a dowry. The dowry was not just a gift from the bride's family. It was a statement of honor, stability, and the seriousness of the alliance. In a society where land, livestock, and weapons marked status, the dowry became both a practical resource and a powerful symbol. For the bride's family, providing a dowry was a way to prove their strength and generosity. A wealthy family might send her into marriage with sheep, goats, or even a prized horse along with woven textiles, tools, and household goods. The more impressive the dowry, the greater the respect the clan commanded. A stingy or meager offering, on the other hand, could cause whispers of weakness, damaging a family's reputation. The groom's family, however, was not simply the beneficiary. Accepting a dowry meant accepting responsibility. It was a pledge to treat the bride well, to uphold the alliance, and to maintain the trust that the transaction represented. In some regions, there is evidence of bride price traditions as well, gifts flowing in the opposite direction from a groom's kin to the bride's family. This exchange reinforced the idea that marriage was not a purchase, but a mutual investment, binding two clans together in obligation and expectation. The items included in dowries also reveal much about Aryan life. Livestock dominated, for animals were wealth in motion. They provided food, clothing, and trade. Metal objects, when available, were prized, as iron weapons and tools gave practical and military advantages. Women's dowries often included woven garments, blankets, and jewelry, not only tokens of beauty, but also proof of the bride's skill and industriousness. These items would stock the new household, ensuring the young couple began their life together with security. Dowry ceremonies were public and festive. When gifts were exchanged, communities gathered to witness the transfer, often accompanied by feasts, music, and blessings. This visibility was important. It ensured that the marriage contract was not just between two families, but acknowledged and upheld by the entire clan network. Beyond economics, the dowry carried spiritual weight. It marked the bride's transition from one family to another, smoothing her passage into her husband's household. In this way, the dowry was not only wealth, but a bridge connecting old ties with new responsibilities and ensuring that the alliance would endure. Among the Aryans, marriage was not only a social and economic contract, it was also a sacred moment that touched the spiritual world. Central to the ceremony were fertility rites, rituals designed to ensure that the union would be fruitful, that children would be born, and that the land and herds would prosper under the blessing of the gods. Without fertility, marriage lost much of its purpose, for the strength of a clan depended on the growth of families. Before the marriage feast, sacrifices were often made to deities tied to fertility and prosperity. Archaeological evidence and later Roman accounts suggest that animals such as sheep, goats, or bulls were offered to invoke divine favor. The blood of the sacrifice was sometimes sprinkled around the wedding site, symbolizing life and continuity. In certain regions, the couple themselves may have been anointed with blood or oil, marking them as participants in a ritual larger than themselves. Fires too played a role. In many Indo-European traditions, flames symbolized purification and new beginnings, and the Aryans were no different. Couples might walk around a fire, leap over flames, or share a meal prepared in the sacrificial hearth. These acts were not merely symbolic. They tied the couple to the eternal cycle of birth, death, and renewal that governed all life in Aryan belief. The bride was often the focus of these fertility rites. Dressed in her finest garments and adorned with jewelry, she was presented as both the bearer of future children and the living embodiment of prosperity. Female relatives sometimes accompanied her with chants, dances, or blessings, invoking the ancestors and spirits of fertility. Herbs and flowers may have been woven into her attire, each chosen for its symbolic power to encourage health, love, and fecundity. The groom, meanwhile, was expected to prove his readiness as a protector and provider. In some traditions, he might participate in ritual hunts or contests of strength before marriage, demonstrating that he was worthy of raising a household. These displays tied masculinity to fertility as well, for a strong hunter meant a strong lineage. Altogether, these rites infused marriage with a sacred dimension that went beyond contracts and dowries. To marry was not only to bind families together, it was to invite the gods to bless the union, to renew the strength of the clan, and to ensure that life itself would continue through children, herds, and fields. No Aryan marriage was complete without music and dance. Once the dowries were exchanged and the rituals performed, the serious business of alliance turned into a public display of joy. For the clans, this was more than entertainment. It was a chance to celebrate survival, kinship, and the continuity of their people. Music carried the rhythm of the feast. Simple instruments such as flutes, horns, and stringed lyres set the tone, while drums and rattles drove the beat. Songs often recounted heroic deeds, legendary ancestors, or the blessings of the gods. At weddings, verses were improvised to praise the bride's beauty, the groom's strength, and the union of their families. These songs reinforced the purpose of the gathering to bind the living community together while honoring the voices of the past. Dance was equally central. Men and women alike joined in circular dances, hand in hand, moving to the rhythm of drums. Circles represented unity, endlessness, and the eternal cycles of life and death. Some dances were slow and solemn, mirroring the dignity of the occasion. Others were wild and energetic, symbolizing fertility, vitality, and the strength of the new household. Youth sometimes performed competitive dances showing agility and endurance, while elders moved with measured grace, reminding all of the wisdom that guided the clan. The feasting that accompanied these performances was lavish, at least by Aryan standards. Roasted meat from sacrificial animals was shared among all, with the choicest cuts reserved for the bride, groom, and leading elders. Wine, mead, or fermented drinks flowed freely, loosening tongues and fueling songs late into the night. Food was not merely nourishment, but part of the ritual. Eating together was an act of solidarity, a sign that the whole community stood behind the new marriage. At times, the festivities could last for days, drawing in not just immediate kin, but neighboring clans as well. These moments were more than private affairs. They were opportunities to reinforce alliances, settle disputes, and remind everyone of the bonds that connected them. Laughter, dancing, and song helped smooth tensions, ensuring that even rival families could share in the joy of the occasion. In this way, Aryan wedding celebrations were not frivolous diversions. They were affirmations of life and continuity, where music, dance, and feasting transformed the obligations of marriage into communal joy. Through rhythm, movement, and shared food, the people of the Highlands declared, "This union is not just for two, but for us all." For the Aryans, marriage was not only a social and economic alliance. It was a sacred act requiring the blessing of the gods, and blessings in their world were rarely free. To secure divine favor, animal sacrifices were central to the wedding ritual, standing as both an offering and a symbolic transfer of life. The type of animal chosen depended on the wealth and standing of the family. A wealthy clan might sacrifice a bull or a horse, animals associated with strength, fertility, and prestige. More modest families might offer sheep, goats, or pigs, creatures still tied to prosperity and reproduction. Regardless of size, each sacrifice carried the same weight. A life given to ensure the fertility of the new couple, the health of future children, and the prosperity of the united clans. The act itself was often public, performed before the gathered community. Priests or clan elders with ritual authority oversaw the proceedings. The animal was adorned with garlands or painted markings, then led to an altar or sacred stone. With prayers and invocations to Aryan deities, its blood was spilled onto the ground, mingling with the soil as a sign of renewal and continuity. The earth drank the sacrifice, and in return, it was believed the gods would grant abundance. Parts of the animal were often burned in a fire, the smoke rising toward the heavens as a message to the divine. The remainder was cooked and shared among the guests during the wedding feast. This act of communal eating gave the sacrifice a second meaning. It reminded all present that marriage was not only blessed by the gods, but also sustained by the unity of the people. To eat the sacrificial meat was to partake in the sacred contract, binding every participant to the success of the marriage. Sacrifice also carried an element of protection. The spilling of blood was thought to ward off evil spirits and misfortune, shielding the couple from harm in their new life together. It was a way of cleansing, ensuring that no bad omens followed them into their household. Through these rituals, Aryan weddings bridged the human and divine worlds. Sacrifices gave weight to promises, reminding everyone that marriage was more than a social bond. It was a sacred covenant upheld by gods, ancestors, and the blood of offerings poured into the earth. In Aryan society, the bride was more than a participant in marriage. She was the centerpiece of the ritual, the symbol of fertility, prosperity, and the continuation of the clan. While men negotiated the terms of the marriage and performed sacrifices, the women ensured that the traditions surrounding the bride were observed with care. These customs elevated the bride into a figure of both honor and responsibility, carrying the hopes of two families in her new household. Preparation began days before the wedding. Female relatives bathed the bride, combed her hair, and adorned her with jewelry. Necklaces of bronze, silver, or glass beads reflected her family's wealth, while belts and fibula brews fastened garments that displayed her skill in weaving. Some items were heirlooms passed down through generations, linking her to the women who came before. This dressing was not just beautification. It was a rite of transformation, marking her passage from maiden to wife. Symbolic rituals surrounded her departure from her natal household. In some traditions, she may have been veiled, representing both modesty and the mystery of her new role. Women sang laments, bittersweet songs mourning the bride's separation from her family while blessing her future. These chants underscored the reality that marriage meant leaving one world behind to enter another. The journey to the groom's house was itself a ritual, often accompanied by relatives. The bride was led in procession, sometimes on horseback, sometimes on foot through the community. Along the way, neighbors blessed her with gifts of food, drink, or tokens meant to ward off misfortune. This public passage transformed her from daughter to wife before the eyes of all, ensuring her transition was witnessed and legitimized. Once at the groom's home, additional rituals reinforced her new identity. She might circle the hearth, symbolizing her entry into the spiritual heart of the household. Bread, milk, or honey could be offered to her as omens of abundance. In some cases, she lit a new fire in the home, carrying forward the symbolism of continuity and fertility. Despite her limited voice in the arrangement of her marriage, the rituals centered on the bride affirmed her vital role. She was not merely moving between families. She embodied the promise of future generations, carrying with her the blessings of her kin, the hopes of her ancestors, and the sacred trust of ensuring the clan's survival. Every Aryan marriage was more than a personal union. It was a political and social contract woven into the fabric of clan alliances. In a world where survival depended on networks of kinship, each marriage tightened bonds between groups, created obligations, and sometimes healed old wounds. To the Aryans, the wedding feast was as much about strengthening the clan's future as it was about celebrating the bride and groom. Alliances formed through marriage were practical tools of diplomacy. Rival clans might use marriage to end feuds, sealing peace with blood ties rather than fragile treaties. A son marrying into a rival household meant that both sides now had shared grandchildren, and killing kin was a line few were willing to cross. In other cases, clans sought partners not for peace, but for power, binding themselves to wealthy neighbors, skilled warriors, or families with broad trade connections. The obligations of these alliances ran deep. Families were expected to support one another in times of famine, conflict, or raiding. A man might call on his wife's clan for reinforcements in war or for food if crops failed. Similarly, a woman could appeal to her natal family for protection if mistreated, creating a system of checks that ensured some balance of power. This network of obligations meant that marriage ties could ripple across whole regions, shaping Aryan politics in subtle but lasting ways. Marriage also reinforced social hierarchy. The most prestigious unions were between powerful clans, often accompanied by lavish dowries and grand feasts. Lesser families benefited indirectly as alliances trickled down, influencing trade disputes and local leadership. In this way, marriage mapped the social order, displaying who held influence and who sought to rise higher. Communal participation made these alliances tangible. When a wedding was celebrated, the entire community witnessed the new bond. Songs praised not just the bride and groom, but also the unity of clans. Guests who feasted together became part of the covenant, reminded that their fortunes were now intertwined. In essence, marriage was the glue of Aryan society. It bridged rivalries, bolstered security, and maintained the delicate balance of power among fiercely independent clans. While two young people stood at the center, the real marriage was between entire lineages, their shared destiny binding them far more tightly than any written contract ever could. Though the Aryans eventually faded from history, absorbed into the Roman world and later overshadowed by new cultures, echoes of their marriage traditions lingered long after their tribal societies dissolved. These customs, rooted in clan loyalty, fertility rites, and communal celebration, left an imprint on the social fabric of the Balkans, where kinship and marriage continue to be understood as more than private unions. One enduring legacy was the centrality of the clan. The Aryans believed marriage bound not only individuals but entire lineages, a concept that persisted for centuries in Balkan villages. Even into medieval and early modern times, Marriages were arranged with an eye towards strengthening alliances and securing protection, much as the Arians once did. The idea that one family's honor was tied to the alliances of another continued to shape negotiations and expectations around marriage. Their fertility rituals, too, echoed across generations. Though the blood sacrifices of bulls and goats eventually gave way to Christian blessings, the symbolism of fire, food, and abundance remained. Lighting the hearth in a new home, blessing bread and wine for newlyweds, or circling a fire during festivals can all be seen as distant reflections of Aryan practices that once bound people to the gods of nature and fertility. The communal aspect of Aryan weddings, the music, dances, and feasts also proved remarkably resilient. Traditional circle dances performed at weddings across the Balkans, even today, recall the ancient symbolism of unity and continuity. The role of song, improvising verses to honor the bride and groom, also survived, adapting to new languages and faiths, but preserving the same function, to publicly affirm marriage as a celebration for all, not just for two. Perhaps the most telling legacy lies in the balance between duty and personal choice. For the Aryans, arranged marriages ensured stability. And while modern cultures have shifted toward individual preference, traces of this collective mindset linger. Even now, in some rural traditions, elders play a strong role in approving or guiding unions, echoing the ancient belief that marriage is too important to be left entirely to youthful desire. In the end, Aryan marriage traditions reveal a people who understood that survival rested on bonds between men and women, between families, between clans, and between humans and the divine. Though the Aryans themselves vanished from history's stage, the patterns they would through marriage survived, carried forward in rituals, symbols, and the enduring human need to find unity in the face of life's uncertainties. Harold Sigurd's son, the man who would later be remembered as Hardrudder, the Hard Ruler, entered the world in 1015 at a time when Norway was caught between chaos and kingship. He was born into the powerful house of Sigurdsir, a minor king in the fertile region of Ringerike. His mother, Oster Gudbrand, was already well known in Norway's political circles, having been the mother of Olaf Haraldsson, the future St. Olaf and King of Norway. That connection placed young Harold in the heart of dynastic ambition from the very start. Norway at this time was no peaceful kingdom. The land was a patchwork of chieftains, rival kings, and foreign interests, with Denmark and England both casting long shadows across the North Sea. The Viking Age was still alive with its old spirit of raiding and conquest, but Christianity was beginning to reshape society. Harold grew up at the crossroads of these traditions, hearing stories of gods and sagas, while watching priests and bishops establish the new faith in his homeland. It was a childhood steeped in both sword and sermon. What made Harold stand out, even in his youth, was his sheer physicality and fierce determination. Later sagas describe him as unusually tall, perhaps over 6 feet, towering above most men of his time, with piercing eyes and a commanding presence. By the time he was a teenager, he was said to be restless, bold, and already skilled with weapons. His half-brother, Olaf, ambitious to secure Norway under one crown, became both an inspiration and a protector. Yet Harold's childhood was far from safe. To grow up in a royal household in 11th century Norway meant living under constant threat. Alliances shifted like tides and enemies were never far away. For Harold, this environment fostered resilience and ambition. He was not destined to live quietly on his father's lands. He was shaped to fight, to lead, and to carve out a place in a violent world. In Harold's birth, we see the emergence of a figure who embodied the last great wave of Viking ambition. He was the youngest son, not expected to inherit much, but fate had larger plans. From the moment he was born, Harold's life was set on a course of blood, exile, and conquest. A saga that would stretch across continents and end in one of the defining battles of the Viking Age. By the summer of 1030, Harold was only 15 years old, but already he found himself marching toward one of the most decisive battles in Norway's history. His half-brother Olaf Haraldsson, later canonized as Saint Olaf, had been ousted from the throne by a coalition of Norwegian chieftains allied with the powerful Danish king Knud the Great. Olaf, determined to reclaim his crown, gathered loyalists for a desperate campaign to retake Norway. Among them was young Harold, eager to prove himself in battle. The armies met at Stiklestad, a rural valley that would forever be etched into legend. On one side stood Olaf and his faithful warriors, many of them drawn from the smaller clans still loyal to his rule. On the other, an overwhelming force of rebels supported by Denmark, eager to see Olaf fall once and for all. The odds were grim, yet Harold refused to be left behind. Armed with sword and shield, he entered the shield wall alongside hardened veterans, the fate of his brother and perhaps his own destiny hanging in the balance. The battle was brutal and chaotic. Spears clashed against shields, arrows darkened the sky, and war cries echoed through the valley. Olaf fought valiantly, but was struck down during the melee. His death later remembered as martyrdom for Christianity in Norway. Harold, though barely more than a boy, fought fiercely at his brother's side until he too was struck with grievous wounds. Cut and bleeding, he fell amid the carnage. But unlike Olaf, he survived. His survival, however, meant exile. With Olaf dead and the rebellion victorious, Harold could not remain in Norway. If captured, he would likely have been executed, another casualty of dynastic struggle. Instead, he fled eastward with a handful of loyal companions, leaving behind his homeland and family. The Battle of Stiklestad was both a crushing defeat and a strange beginning for Harold. It robbed him of his brother, his home, and his immediate future in Norway. Yet, it also propelled him onto the world stage. Forced into exile, he would wander farther than almost any Viking before him to Kiev, Constantinople, Sicily, and beyond, carrying with him the scars of Stiklestad and the burning ambition to one day return as more than just a survivor after the blood-soaked fields of Slustad. Harald Hardrada was a fugitive. Norway was close to him, and Knut's dominion stretched wide across Scandinavia. For a young warrior with ambition as vast as Harold's, exile was not an end, but an opening. With a band of loyal men, he turned east across the forests and rivers of Sweden until he reached the glittering court of Prince Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev. Yaroslav's court was a crossroads of cultures. Slavs, Norsemen, Greeks, and steppe nomads mingled in the bustling capital. To Harold, it was a place of opportunity. He offered his sword to Yaroslav and soon gained a place among the prince's elite warriors. The sagas describe Harold as bold and commanding, and even in his youth, his charisma drew men to follow him. Yet Kiev was only a stepping stone. Harold sought adventure, riches, and renown beyond anything Scandinavia could offer. From Kiev, he traveled south to the great empire of Byzantium. Arriving in Constantinople, Mlagard, the great city as the Norse called it, Harold entered the service of the Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite corps of foreign warriors. These men, famed for their loyalty and ferocity, were often recruited from the Norse world, and Harold quickly rose among them. His height, presence, and battle-tested courage made him stand out, even in a brotherhood of hardened killers. For nearly a decade, Harold fought under the banners of Byzantium. He sailed to Sicily, battling Arab forces. He marched through Asia Minor, clashing with enemies of the empire. He even fought in the Holy Land, guarding pilgrims and securing routes for the emperor. The Saras, never modest in their praise, claim he fought 80 battles during these years, earning both wealth and scars. The Varangian Guard was more than a military unit. It was a brotherhood bound by oath and fortune. Harold's service brought him immense riches, gold, jewels, and silks from the empire's treasuries. Wealth he carefully stored away with Yaroslav in Kiev for his eventual return to Norway. But just as important as treasure was reputation. Harold's name became known far beyond Scandinavia. He was no longer just a boy who had fled Slistad. He was a commander of the Emperor's Guard, a man who had carved his legend across the Mediterranean. Exile had turned into opportunity. In Constantinople, Harold became more than a dispossessed prince. He became a warrior of renown, his saga growing with each campaign, his ambition burning hotter than ever. Harold's years in Constantinople transformed him from a wounded exile into a seasoned commander. To the Zantines, he was known not as Harold, but as a Rultais, and within the Varangian Guard, he quickly distinguished himself for his cunning and ferocity. These warriors were the emperor's personal bodyguards, feared throughout the empire as much for their towering presence as for their loyalty, and Harold soon rose to a place of leadership among them. The sagas portray him as restless, never content to remain in garrison when there was fighting to be had. He fought in campaigns across the empire's vast frontiers. In Sicily, he joined the Byzantine struggle against Arab forces, storming fortresses and raiding coastal towns. In the east, he clashed with Bulgars and other enemies threatening imperial borders. Some stories even place him in Jerusalem, where he supposedly helped guard the holy city during an expedition into the Levant. Whether every tale is true or embroidered, the impression is clear. Harold sought war like others sought food, and he found it in abundance. His service brought him immense wealth. The Varangians were famously rewarded with gold and plunder, and Harold proved shrewd in hoarding his earnings. Instead of spending it all in Constantinople's taverns and markets, he sent his treasures back to Kiev, entrusting them to Prince Yaroslav for safekeeping. This prudence showed that Harold's ambitions were always fixed on the future, on returning to Norway, not as an exile, but as a man wealthy enough to command loyalty. Yet Harold's rise was not without controversy. The sagas hint at clashes with Byzantine officials, even suggesting that he may have fallen out of favor with the emperor. One tale accuses him of imprisoning a noble woman or overstepping his authority, forcing him to flee the empire under strained circumstances. Whether exaggerated or not, the stories capture Harold's character, bold, willful, and unwilling to bend, even to emperors. By the time he left Constantinople around 1042, Harold was no longer the boy who had limped from Stiklestad. He had become a hardened commander, a man who had seen the wealth of empires and tested himself against the strongest foes of his age. Gold filled his coffers, scars lined his body, and ambition drove his heart. The exile had been tempered in fire, and now Harold Hardrada was ready to reclaim his destiny. By the early 1040s, Harold Hardrada had everything a Viking prince could want: gold, renown, and battle-forged authority. What he lacked was the one thing he had been chasing since his youth: a throne. With the wealth he had carefully stored in Kiev and the prestige of his Byzantine campaigns, Harold returned to the north, determined to carve out his rightful place in Scandinavia. His first stop was Kiev, where he reclaimed the treasures he had entrusted to Prince Yaroslav the Wise. But his ties to Yaroslav went deeper than gold. During his years abroad, Harold had married Yaroslav's daughter, Elis, cementing a powerful alliance with the Kievan court. With his wife and riches at his side, Harold sailed back toward Norway, ready to challenge the political order that had excluded him for more than a decade. At this time, Norway was under the rule of King Magnus the Good, the illegitimate son of Harold's half-brother, Saint Olaf. Magnus was respected and capable, but Harold saw an opportunity. He claimed his share of the kingdom as Olaf's surviving brother, leveraging both bloodline and the immense wealth he had brought home. Magnus could not ignore Harold's challenge, especially since Harold had also gathered support in Denmark and Sweden. The confrontation did not end in bloodshed, however. Instead, the two men agreed to share the throne, ruling Norway as co-kings. It was an uneasy arrangement full of rivalry and suspicion. Harold, older and far more experienced, was impatient with Magnus' authority, while Magnus, wary of Harold's ambition, kept a careful watch on his uncle. Yet, this compromise allowed Harold to re-establish himself in Norway without plunging the kingdom into outright civil war. When Magnus died suddenly in 1047, Harold became the sole king of Norway. At last, after years of exile, mercenary service, and restless ambition, the throne he had sought since Stiklad was his. But Harold was not content with Norway alone. Almost immediately, he turned his gaze outward to Denmark, to England, to anywhere his sword and cunning might expand his power. Harold Hardrada had returned home, not as a fugitive, but as a ruler. Yet, true to his nature, he would not stop at simply holding Norway. For Harold, kingship was only the beginning of a saga that would soon stretch across northern Europe and eventually bring him face to face with destiny on an English battlefield. Harold Hardrada was never satisfied with simply being king of Norway. From the moment he secured the throne in 1047, He turned his attention to Denmark, a kingdom with which Norway had long been locked in rivalry. To Harold, ruling Norway was not enough. He wanted the full legacy of his Viking forefathers, the North Sea Empire that once bound Denmark, Norway, and even England together under one crown. His adversary was King Svein Estridsson, a cunning and resilient ruler who had already weathered the storm of Magnus the Good. With Magnus dead, Harold launched campaign after campaign against him. For nearly 2 decades, the two kings waged an exhausting struggle, raiding, countering, and battling for supremacy across the seas. Harold's fleet struck the Danish coastlines relentlessly, burning villages, seizing livestock, and terrorizing Swein's subjects in an effort to undermine his support. The Saras describe Harold as merciless in these wars, earning his title Hardrada, the Hard Ruler. He was a man who ruled through iron will and iron sword, punishing disloyalty and driving his men with ruthless discipline. Yet, despite his ferocity, Denmark proved stubborn. Svein always seemed able to recover, rallying his forces and striking back when Harold's fleets withdrew. The conflict became less about decisive victories and more about wearing the other side down. Naval battles played a central role. Viking longships, sleek and deadly, filled the seas as Harold attempted to blockade Denmark and force submission. He fought fiercely at battles, such as the one near Nyssa in 1062, where Harold's fleet inflicted heavy losses on Svein, but failed to destroy him outright. It was a frustrating pattern. Harold won victories on the battlefield, but he could not translate them into political dominance. By the mid-1060s, both men were weary. Harold had drained Norway's resources, demanding heavy taxes to fund his endless campaigns, while Svein stubbornly clung to his throne. In 1064, the two finally reached a truce, recognizing each other's rule and ending the destructive stalemate. For Harold, it was a bitter compromise. He had dreamed of uniting Norway and Denmark, but instead he was forced to settle for peace without conquest. Yet Harold's ambition did not cool. If Denmark could not be his, perhaps England could. Rumors of opportunity across the sea soon caught his ear, and Harold Hardrada, true to his restless nature, prepared to gamble everything on one final daring invasion. By the early 1060s, Harold Hardrada had fought in the east, ruled in the north, and challenged Denmark in endless war. Yet his ambition still burned. When word came that the English throne might be within his grasp, Harold seized upon it as the ultimate prize, a chance to restore the old Viking legacy of England as part of a northern empire. The pretext came through family ties and politics. The Danish king Cut the Great had once ruled England, as well as Denmark and Norway, creating a vast North Sea dominion. Though that empire had fragmented after his death, Harold believed he still had a legitimate claim inherited through treaties made between Magnus the Good and Harth of Denmark. When Hagnut died in 1042, Magnus had briefly styled himself King of England. After Magnus' death, Harold declared that his right to England had passed to him. It was a claim built on tenuous legal strings, but Harold was not a man to let paperwork stop him. Opportunity arose in 1066. King Edward the Confessor of England died without a clear heir, sparking a crisis of succession. Harold Godwin's son, the powerful Earl of Wessex, seized the crown, but rivals immediately challenged him. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed Edward had promised him the throne, and Harold Hardrada saw his own chance to press his inherited claim by force. Harold's bid was not made alone. Tostig Godwin's son, Harold's own estranged brother, had been exiled from England and sought revenge. Tostig allied with Harold, promising support and urging him to invade. For Harold, this was the spark he needed, the chance to unite his warriors, revive Viking glory, and perhaps become the last great conqueror of the age. In the summer of 1066, Harold gathered a massive fleet. Some sources claimed nearly 300 ships and sailed for England. His warriors were hardened veterans, many of them veterans of the wars against Denmark, eager for plunder and glory. As the sails caught the wind and the prows cut through the waves, Harold must have believed destiny was at last in his hands. England, rich and fertile, awaited him. The saga of Harold Hardrada was about to reach its climax. Not in Norway, not in Byzantium, but on English soil. In September of 1066, Harald Hardrada's long ambition turned into action. With a fleet of hundreds of ships and thousands of men, he crossed the North Sea to stake his claim on the English crown. At his side was Tosta Godwin's son, the bitter exiled brother of Harold, the newly crowned king of England. Together they planned to topple Harold's rule and carve out a new North Sea empire. The invasion began in the north of England, where Harold struck with the speed and ferocity that had defined his career. He landed his forces near the rivers and quickly advanced on the city of York, the great northern stronghold. At Fulford on September 20th, 1066, Harold met the forces of the northern ears, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria. The battle was fierce, but Harold's veterans proved unstoppable. His disciplined warriors drove the English back, crushing their resistance. The victory was decisive. York submitted, and the gates of northern England seemed open to him. After decades of war, exile, and ambition, Harold stood on the brink of triumph. Flushed with victory, he began to organize his hold on the north. Demands of loyalty were taken, hostages secured, and supplies gathered. Harold was confident enough to send part of his fleet back toward Norway, believing the campaign was nearly won. With York under control, he expected the English crown would soon be his. But fate moved faster than he anticipated. King Harold Godwin's son, who had been preparing to face William of Normandy in the south, marched his army north at breakneck speed, covering nearly 200 m in less than a week. Harold caught Harald Hardrada completely off guard. The English king's sudden arrival would force a confrontation neither side could avoid. Harold, camped near Stamford Bridge with part of his army, had not even donned full armor when news reached him that Harold Godwin's son was closing in. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic clashes in English history. For Harald Hardrada, it would be the final test of his lifelong ambition, a battle that would decide not only his fate, but the very end of the Viking Age. On September 25th, 1066, the saga of Harald Hardrada reached its final act at Stamford Bridge. Harold, fresh from victory at Fulford and confident in his hold over northern England, was caught unprepared. His men were spread out, many unarmored, some even resting in the sun. They expected negotiations with York, not the sudden arrival of Harold Godwinson's army, which had marched north at incredible speed. The clash began with a desperate defense. According to legend, a single giant Norse warrior held the bridge against waves of English soldiers, cutting them down until he was finally killed from beneath by a spear thrust through the planks. This act of defiance bought Harold's army precious time, but the odds were stacked against them. Harold Godwinson's forces were fresh, heavily armed, and eager to crush the invaders. Harold, true to his name, hard ruler, refused to retreat. Tall, fierce, and unmistakable on the battlefield, he led his warriors into the fray with the same relentless courage that had carried him from Norway to Byzantium and beyond. But fate was merciless. In the heat of the battle, an arrow struck him in the throat. The great Viking king collapsed, his voice silenced in the chaos of clashing steel and shouting men. The death of Harald Hardrada shattered Norse morale. His men fought on desperately, but without their leader, the tide turned quickly. Thousands of Vikings were cut down, and of the great fleet that had crossed the North Sea, only a fraction returned. The sagas tell us that while Harold had arrived in England with over 300 ships, barely 24 were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. Harold's fall at Stamford Bridge was more than the death of a king. It was the symbolic end of an era. For nearly 3 centuries, Vikings had raided, traded, and ruled across Europe, feared as the scourge of kingdoms and empires. With Harold's defeat, the age of great Viking adventurers effectively closed. Just weeks later, William of Normandy would win at Hastings, reshaping England forever. But the Viking threat was finished. Thus ended the saga of Harald Hardrada, warrior, exile, mercenary, king, and would-be conqueror of England. His life embodied the restless spirit of the Viking Age, and his death marked its final chapter. After Stamford Bridge, the world of Europe moved on. But Harold's legend, fierce, ambitious, and unyielding, lived on in the sagas that still call him the last great Viking.